What's up everyone, welcome back to another Turok video. So as of recording this, the original Turok trilogy is a part of the Steam Summer Sale, and with Turok Origins bringing some attention back to the series, I figured this would be a good time to talk to anyone who might be looking to try the Turok franchise for the first time. Or maybe your first and only Turok was Evolution or the 2008 reboot, and now you want to see what the trilogy is all about. Obviously Steam sales come and go, so if you're watching this later and the games aren't on sale anymore, don't worry, this video should still help you figure out which one is worth starting with. And honestly, I don't think there's one perfect answer for everybody. It really depends on what kind of player you are. While each game has a lot of similarities, they also play pretty differently. So this isn't really going to be a ranking video. Instead, I want to go over what each game has to offer. The gameplay, the level design, the weapons, the aesthetic, the music, and what type of player I think each game is best for. Because maybe you want the purest classic Turok experience. Maybe you want the game with the craziest weapons. Maybe you want the one with more story and less getting lost. So with that said, let's start with the first game. Turok Dinosaur Hunter. This is the foundation of the Acclaim era Turok series, and honestly, I still think this might be the best starting point for most people, especially if you want to understand what made Turok feel different from the other shooters at the time, because Turok 1 has a very specific feeling to it. It's not just a hallway shooter. A lot of the game is built around exploration. You're running through these big open feeling levels looking for keys, finding weapons, and dealing with platforming sections. If I had to compare it to something, I'd say Turok 1 feels like a weird mix of Doom and Quake. You have the fast movement, key hunting, secrets, and enemy variety you expect from a 90s shooter, but instead of mostly running through corridors, tech bases, castles, or hellish arenas, you're running through jungles, ruins, caves, and ancient-looking environments. That outdoor adventure feeling was a pretty big part of what made Turok stand out. Turok 1 also has pretty big enemy variety. People hear Dinosaur Hunter and obviously expect dinosaurs. And yeah, there are dinosaurs, but you're also fighting humans, demons, robots, insects, aliens, and all kinds of weird lost land critters. And that's kind of the point. Even from the beginning, Turok was not just guy shoots dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are iconic, but the actual game was much weirder than that. Now when it comes to the weapons, Turok 1 starts pretty normal. You get your knife, bow, pistol, shotgun, assault rifle, stuff like that. At first it feels like a pretty standard old school shooter arsenal, but the further you get into the game, the wackier the arsenal becomes. You start getting things like the pulse rifle, grenade launcher, missile launcher, minigun, alien weapons, and of course the chronoceptor, basically Turok's version of the BFG. And that's one of the things I love about the first Turok. The weapon progression feels like you start as a hunter trying to survive, and by the end you're basically a tribal space warrior with ancient alien weapons. The guns in Turok 1 also have a really satisfying impact to them. Explosive weapons can send enemies flying, and it can kinda give the combat this goofy but awesome sense of power. Even the non-explosive weapons sound nice and punchy. The level design is probably going to be the make or break part for new players, because if you're exploring, paying attention to your surroundings, finding keys, and slowly figuring out how a level connects together, Turok 1 can be really satisfying. But if you hate being lost or you need constant objective markers telling you exactly where to go, then this game might test your patience. The Night Dive remaster definitely makes it easier to go back to today, but at its core, this is still a 90s FPS. It expects you to explore and you're expected to remember where things are. Aesthetically, I still think the game has a lot of charm. The jungle areas, the ancient ruins, the catacombs, and the sci-fi stuff later on all give that game this really cool mix of primitive and futuristic. And that mix is basically Turok. One foot in ancient warrior fantasy, and the other foot in weird sci-fi. The music fits that perfectly too. It has this tribal, atmospheric, and sometimes intense feeling to it that makes the Lost Land feel dangerous and mysterious. The soundtrack feels epic, but at the same time catchy in a way where you just want to groove while playing the game. So who would I recommend Turok 1 to? I'd recommend it to you if you want the purest classic Turok experience. If you like exploration, if you like old school shooters, if you like atmosphere, if you like platforming mixed into your FPS games. But if you hate maze-like levels, old school design, or hunting for keys, this might not be the easiest one for you to start with. Now let's talk about Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. This is the game most people probably think of when they talk about Turok, and for good reason. Turok 2 is basically the first game turned up to an insane level. It's more ambitious, it has more story, more enemies, bigger levels, crazier weapons, and honestly, it might be the most Turok game in the entire trilogy, but it's also the one that asks the most from new players. The first thing you'll probably notice is the presentation. Turok 2 looks and feels way more advanced than the first game. The environments are more detailed, the enemies have more animation, and every level feels more like its own world. The levels in this game are pretty massive, and that might be a downside to some people, because the backtracking here can be worse than Dinosaur Hunter in my opinion. The remaster helps with this a lot because you have optional markers and fast travel between checkpoints, but the game is still built around big levels, objectives, backtracking, and exploration. So if you love huge levels, Turok 2 gives you a lot to chew on, but if you hate backtracking, Turok 2 might have you questioning your life choices. Gameplay wise, Turok 2 feels like a more polished and more ambitious version of the first game, but also a more demanding one. There's a lot more to do in this game. You're not just finding keys anymore, you're saving children, activating distress beacons, destroying mission objectives, protecting energy totems, collecting feathers, and dealing with portals that may or may not throw you into Oblivion's basement. But let's be real, the weapons are where this game becomes legendary. You've got the tech bow, mag 60, double barrel pump action shotgun, plasma rifle, shredder, firestorm cannon, scorpion launcher, cerebral bore, and the nuke, which is basically Turok 2's chronoceptor. And the thing about Turok 2's weapons is that so many of them have personality. The shredder fires bouncing projectiles that behave differently depending on if you're using regular shells or explosive shells. The firestorm cannon is pretty much a futuristic minigun, and it sounds mean as hell. The scorpion launcher locks onto enemies and launches 3 missiles. Locked on enemies will even run for their lives once they realize they fucked up. A bit overkill? Maybe. But it's still badass nonetheless. And of course, there's the cerebral bore. This thing locks onto an enemy's head, drills into their skull, and then explodes. You can even see the brain matter shooting out with the blood. That is absolutely insane, and you know what? That's Turok. That's why I think Turok 2 is probably the best game in the trilogy if what you care about most is weapon creativity. The music is also incredible. Turok 2 has a much bigger, darker, more epic sound than the first game. It makes the game feel like you're not just surviving the Lost Land anymore. You're fighting through this huge cosmic war against something ancient and dangerous. That's also where the story and lore start becoming a much bigger part of Turok. You have Joshua Fireseed, Adon, the Primogen, the energy totems, Oblivion portals, Dinosaurs, the Lightship. This is where the series really starts leaning harder into the sci-fi and cosmic side of things. So who would I recommend Turok 2 to? I'd recommend it to you if you want the biggest and most ambitious game in the trilogy. If you want the best weapons, if you want more story and lore, if you want huge levels, if you want each area to feel completely different from the last. But I wouldn't recommend starting here if you get frustrated easily when the game doesn't tell you exactly where to go. Now let's talk about Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion. This is probably the weirdest one to recommend because depending on what you want from Turok, Turok 3 might either be the easiest one for you to get into or the most disappointing one. You see, Turok 3 is much more linear than the first 2 games. There's less key hunting, there's less getting lost in giant maze-like levels, there's more story, more cutscenes, more voice acting, and a much stronger focus on moving you from one area to the next. And honestly, for some people, that might be a good thing, because not everybody wants to wander around giant levels trying to figure out where the hell that last key or objective is. Some people just want to shoot monsters, follow the story, and keep moving. And Turok 3 is much better for that type of player. And this is where the comparison to Half-Life makes the most sense. I'm not saying Turok 3 is Half-Life, but it does feel like Turok trying to move toward that more cinematic, story-driven FPS structure that became more popular around that time. Instead of, here's a giant level, go figure it out, it's more like, follow the story, move to the chapter, watch the cutscene, fight the boss, keep going. That makes it feel more modern in some ways, but it also means it loses some of that classic Turok exploration. So depending on what you want, that could be a positive or a negative. The big gameplay difference here is that you get 2 playable characters, Danielle and Joseph Fireseed. They both share the same basic weapon types, but the variations of those weapons change depending on which character you're playing as. For example, both characters get weapons like the pistol, shotgun, and even the cerebral bore, but each get their own versions as well. Danielle gets the Mag 60, the Fire Swarm, and the cerebral burst. She also gets a grappling hook which allows her to reach spots Joseph can't. Joseph gets the silenced pistol, the shredder, and the cerebral possessor. He also gets night vision goggles which let him access areas you couldn't reach with Danielle. That gives the game a reason to be played more than once because you're not just picking different character models, you're changing how you move through parts of the game and what tools you have. I think that's one of the coolest ideas in Turok 3. The problem is the game is short, especially compared to Turok 2. Turok 2 feels like this giant journey across multiple worlds. Turok 3 feels more like a fast, story-driven shooter that you can knock out pretty quickly. But again, that might not be a bad thing depending on who you are. The level design is also completely different. Instead of starting in the jungle or the lost land, you start in a city being overrun by Oblivion's forces. Then you move to places like a military facility, strange lost land areas, familiar environments, and eventually more Oblivion locations. So the game has variety, but it doesn't have the same exploration heavy structure as the first two. The aesthetic in Turok 3 is also darker and has more horror and sci-fi vibes. Oblivion definitely gives the game a different tone from the Campaigner or the Primogen. I don't think it fully captures the same magic as Turok 1 or 2, but I understand what they were trying to do. Even if it's not my favorite Turok, I can appreciate that it tried to be different. The music fits that darker tone too. The composer here isn't the same as the first two games, but I still think he does a pretty good job. The music is actually more dynamic this time since it changes as you enter new areas in each chapter. It works for the game, and each track does a good job reflecting what's happening around you and making each level feel different from the last. So, who would I recommend Turok 3 to? I'd recommend it to you if you want the most straightforward game in the trilogy, if you want more story, if you want more than one playable character, if you want something on the shorter side, if you want less key hunting and less maze-like levels. Turok 3 might actually be the easiest game for a modern player to finish, but I would not tell someone to start with Turok 3 if they truly want to understand why people fell in love with the classic formula in the first place. Because it's a good game, but it's also the one that feels the least like the first two. So where should you start? Here's how I'd break it down. If you want the purest, classic Turok experience, start with Turok Dinosaur Hunter. If you want the biggest, craziest, most iconic Turok experience, play Turok 2 Seeds of Evil. And if you want the most accessible, story-driven, easy-to-finish game, then try Turok 3 Shadow of Oblivion. So my personal recommendation, if you're only buying one, I'd say start with either Turok 1 or 2. But if the whole trilogy is on sale for cheap, honestly, I think all three are worth trying, because they're all really fun to play in my opinion. And whether you catch these games on sale or not, I still think the original trilogy is worth looking into, especially if you're curious about Turok before Origins comes out. But those are just my thoughts. Have you played the original Turok trilogy? Which one do you think new players should start with? And if you're new to the series, which one looks the most interesting to you? Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you guys next time. Peace!